You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're listening into part one of a one-to-one conversation between David Longoria of LISC in Phoenix and Ryan Winkle of Rail CDC. They discuss the community work they're doing in Mesa along the light rail line and the impact their work has on local businesses. Stay with us. Today's podcast was produced in partnership with Impact, formerly Railvolution. For a deeper dive on livability issues or to check out the 2023 Impact Transit and Mobility Conference in Phoenix, Arizona, visit impactmobility.org, mpactmobility.org. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful, amazing Patreon supporters. Your support is critical to Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We really appreciate it. To join this gang of zoning misfits and transportation rabble-rousers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks so much to everybody who supports the show, from the bus drivers to the advocates all around the world. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And for more information on our work and where to find our daily newsletter, the transportation scarves, our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, buy books from the authors that join us on the show at our bookshop affiliate site, or find our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice, check out the show notes on your podcatcher or visit theoverheadwire.com. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to the Talking Headways podcast, especially through your podcatchers. With the unfortunate news that Stitcher will stop operations on August 29th, we hope you'll continue to listen on other services. You can find us on Spotify, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Pocket Cast, TuneIn, and many, many more. We'll put our RSS feed in the show notes if that helps you make the switch. Thanks again for listening to Talking Headways. We really do appreciate it, especially those of you who keep coming back each and every week.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Longoria, Program Officer with Local Initiative Support Corporation, or LISC, in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm also a member of the Impact National Steering Committee, and I'm delighted to be here today with my good friend, my collaborator, Ryan Winkle, Executive Director for Rail CDC in Mesa, Arizona. Ryan, welcome.
Thank you, David. Thank you. It's great to be here with you again. Us doing the shows together definitely solidifies our partnership, and definitely what I've noticed is that we've been able to really create much more of a story the more times we get together and talk about these things, and it adds little nuances. So thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you to Impact.
So good to be with you, as always, my friend. Always good to see you. So let's start this conversation just sort of with some basic background information on what Rail is, who you are, and what Rail does and what you do.
Okay, yeah. So I'm Ryan Winkle. I am one of the founders and now executive director of Rail CDC, which stands for Retail, Arts, Innovation, Livability, Community Development Corporation. We are a nonprofit, place-based organization, started around 2013-ish during other neighborhood and corridor things that were happening. And what we kind of do in a simplified way, and we'll get more into this later, is that we do community development, right? So we work with neighborhoods, we work with businesses, and then we work with the neighborhood and business corridor as a whole to deliver small business technical assistance, financial opportunity center opportunities for neighbors, and corridor, comprehensive community development, right? And all of this is in low to moderate income census tracts around transit in the mostly East Valley, but we now work a little bit in Phoenix as well.
Awesome. So what got you into doing comprehensive community development? Like, what was the spark? What was the path that brought you to where you are now?
It's an interesting word that we call it comprehensive community development. And that's probably one of the things that kind of got me into it, because when I got into it, probably around 2011-ish, 11 time, and I was getting really involved in the community. I had just quit a bank, realizing how, they were just basically torturing people with their fees. And, this corporate structure I was like, you know what, I'm going to go off on my own. I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to just build my own job, and I'm going to start a nonprofit, and I'm going to make money, as a job, which was hilarious because still to this day, the Mesa Urban Garden has never paid me probably 1 cent. And it is now over 10 years old. But then during that time, I'd gotten involved with so many, we like to call them townies at the time, downtown Mesa folks. doing different things. And there was just little things kind of magically happening all over the place, little art happenings, little, art parties and whatever different things were happening. And then finally I had ended up, we opened the garden and I was like, all right, now what? Like this didn't work out so well in paying myself for something, And I had met a woman named Terry Benelli, who now we all know as the executive director of LISC Phoenix. Then she was the executive director of a community development financial institution. And she was, shaking things up in downtown. And even more than shaking things up, she was really focused on the light rail extension into downtown Mesa, which, as we all know, in many other cities across the United States, even in the Phoenix metro area, creates huge displacement, creates a lot of business closures. A lot of different things happen around that. So that's kind of how the short version of how I got into all of this.
So nonprofit work, not for the faint of heart, and also not for anybody looking to score a buck, or especially if it's from Mesa Urban Gardens, right?
Right. I mean, it's fiscally in a good shape, but the garden is fiscally in good shape, right?
Right. Also, shout out to Terry, my boss, my executive director. She's still shaking things up as the ED for LISC Phoenix. Oh man, she's like just such a champion for all of the work that we're doing. So quick shout out to Terry.
And if I could add on that just quickly, interestingly enough, she has inspired, I would say, a good majority of the up and coming community development people in the Phoenix metro area through her bringing them into that kind of work. Not just from the East Valley, because as she moved to Phoenix, she's brought in a lot of groups that have continued this work in a very new and innovative way that I think normally wouldn't be in this kind of work. So definitely big shout out.
So like, she's not only like, in addition to all the passion she has for this work, she knows everybody, like seriously, everyone. But funny story about Terry, I'll tell really quickly, is that so we were Flynn Brown Fellows, the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership, not in the same class. She was in the class before mine, and this was like 2012, around that time. And when she took on the executive director position for LISC Phoenix, right before she was about to, she told me at that time, one of these days, I'm going to hire you. And it took her about 8 years to do it, but I got to hand it to her. She came around and she did do it. So I've been with LISC Phoenix for now, for about a year and a half. So she came around. So glad to see that. Okay. Back on track though. So Rail's sort of mantra, or its ethos, its hashtag, if you will, is do it for the neighborhood. Tell me about the story behind that, and tell me more about what that means to you.
So do it for the neighborhood came up kind of just one day randomly, right, as a hashtag, because we've done so many things over time where we're like, okay, we're working with a group of small businesses, or we're working with a corridor that's, changing and growing, or we're doing something with this group of neighborhoods. And as our work kind of grew and changed a little bit, we really started focusing on the idea of displacement. And this wasn't always the case, because I don't think early on we had that kind of the vision to say, doing this kind of work, community development and helping neighborhoods, could lead to them being gentrified and displaced, right? I mean, it seems like so logical when I say it like that, but really when you're in the work, it's not that logical, right? Yeah. It's not an outcome you'd think what's happening. You just think you're helping. And so as we've kind of moved on, we've really incorporated the two outcomes: being born in the neighborhood, finishing in the neighborhood, and leading to an anti-displacement strategy and a community wealth building strategy, all for the purpose of keeping someone, whether it's a business or a neighbor, where they are comfortable, right? I think there's been quite a few books now that have come out that have really kind of highlighted the idea of the neighborhood network and the power that has for people over time, and wealth building and issues that happen in neighborhoods. And so even though we do a lot of work with the corner store, or the Main Street area, and I say that not because we do work on Main Street, but I mean any Main Street. It could be any Main Street, right? It could be any corner store, it could be any neighborhood, but they are all connected. So really, it's just do it for the neighborhood. And when you think about this type of work, I like to think about it from kind of the old days. They had like, in Chicago, they had the Chicago boss, right? And it's like the neighborhood boss. And if you needed anything to happen in that neighborhood, you go to that person. And generally that was very organically grown. So I wanted to, I guess, rethink that in a more of a non-crime oriented way, but a more positive, like, hey, in this neighborhood, it's Las Madres de Mesa. In that neighborhood, it's the artist known as Scarlet. In that neighborhood, it's, whoever it is, right?
Yeah. No, I love that. And it's so funny because you sort of touched upon this a little bit, but doing it for the neighborhood seems so sensible, right? It like, well, of course we're going to do it for the neighborhood, but there's so much packed into that simple phrase. It's not as easy as it sounds. This is to go back to focus a little bit on the comprehensive part of comprehensive community development. This is long game type of stuff. This is not like something you can just sort of pop in for a little while and maybe shake it up a little bit and then be like, peace out. I've done my work. You guys are self-sustainable and so long. I've saved the neighborhood, right?
Dropped in and I saved.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's just so much weight in the simplicity of that work and that mantra. So, man, I love that because it's at once it's simple yet complicated. And it is a very complicated line of work that we're in. But talk about the neighborhood a little bit. Like, what is the area of Mesa that Rail CDC focuses on? Sort of touch a little bit on sort of the commercial corridor aspect of it and the neighborhoods around it, but elaborate on that a little bit more.
So being a place-based organization, and we had just brought on a new operations administrator, and she's pretty new to this work, but does have work, business, and this kind of organizing in her background, And that was my background as community organizing. And I really thought of them as something just kind of the same. It's like, okay, community organizer, you go help the community, you do stuff with the community. But that's much like saying like the difference between we all are not different races, we're all humans. I mean, that's a true statement, but that also belittles the idea that, there's things that create differences in between people and neighborhoods and things and communities, right? And so it's kind of when I think of what is that neighborhood? Is it everywhere? Because the neighborhood is everywhere technically, right? But the neighborhood we really focus on are these 5 places. 4 of them are kind of one is the original downtown Mesa area, which is West Mesa. The second one is slightly to the south of that, which is the Mesa South Side, which is Distrito Latino, which is a Latino-dominated area, not just Mexican, but like many different types of Latino. And then we have the Tempe Apache corridor, La Victoria area, which is one of the original barrios of Arizona, as well as very international in its kind of like restaurants and what's going on there. And then the Asian district, which is kind of where a lot of Asian businesses have convened and surrounded by neighborhoods as well. That's kind of our 4 areas. Each neighborhood has very different wants and desires for their futures. The one we're really focusing on big time right now is the Southside Mesa one. It's probably where we have at this time, because of so long of doing things, the easiest way that we can pick up the phone, call somebody, and because of the trust we've built, we can have an action happen fairly quickly and fairly easily, right? Not to say that it's very, very complicated, like you had mentioned, but it's easier now that we've built the trust over time, right? And to your point about the neighborhoods and why they're different, we can work in some neighborhoods for many years and don't have that same connection because it's, I think, the speed of trust, right? That idea of the speed of trust. And so, yeah, this neighborhood, which we'll pretty much focus on for most of this conversation, probably is the Southside neighborhood.
So I want to touch on a little bit about what you mentioned in describing the area that you work in. There seems to be a strong historical tie to this area. You mentioned La Victoria, which is one of the original barrios in Arizona, not just in the valley, but in the state. And also the Distrito Latino that you work in the Southside neighborhood as well. A lot of history in these places, right? A lot of personal context from the point of view of the families and the generations that have sort of persisted over time. Talk a little bit about who lives there and how the locals describe their place and their sense of place, for that matter. What is it like for people and families trying to live and just get by and work and get ahead?
So when I first started working in this neighborhood, I was really coming at it from a heat and environmental justice perspective. So for me, the idea was to really educate people and then get them involved in what is heat and environmental or like refugeeism in the future. Like what does that mean to a neighborhood like this, right? What we came to find out over time was it was very important, but not understood at first. And the reasons for that is because one of the very first neighbors that I talked to, he basically just said, like, it's always been hot. It's Arizona. Like, no duh, man. You know what I mean? Like, what do you think? It's hot, And then, yeah, right. And then so when I was kind of digging a little further, I'm like, yeah, but don't you drive, your kids walk to the bus station. Don't they think about this as like it could be dangerous or that there's like a future difference of what could happen because of this heat, And the answer really was just no, because this area is a historically migrant worker area that a lot of the folks that had moved here were kind of allowed to move there, because it was the kind of industrial area where the Coors, I think original Coors plant was, or the Coors like bottling area was. And then same with the Sunkist factory. And so people would gather, they would jump on trucks, they would take them all over the different parts of Arizona to work the fields or work the different factories and different things. And so over time, it became, which was, I think, mostly migrant at the beginning. Nowadays, it's a little bit different. Most are second or third generation. Still a lot of first generation Spanish spoken, mostly rentals. I'm going to use mostly's and stuff like that because normally, so my partner in this work, Augie Gastelum, who's actually from the neighborhood, who really actually ignited a lot of the work in that neighborhood specifically. After my environmental crusade, he kind of took on more of the very personal and societal kind of work in that area. But he it's 70% rental roughly or more. And then I think it was like 95% Latino in some way or another, of different types. The neighborhoods are very connected to each other. And so I would say, and this is not a factual number, but just kind of a perceptive number, that there's probably 5-ish different neighborhoods in the South Side, neighborhoods. And back in the day, it was a very big gang. That's why it was called Southside, because it was Southside Mesa. And the people from La Victoria didn't go to Southside Mesa, and Southside Mesa did not go to La Victoria. It's like the two rival Latino gangs back in that time. Over time, the moms got together and kind of got rid of the gangs, but the police still treat it like there's gangs there a lot. And there's definitely stuff happens and there's crime and whatever. But I wouldn't think it was a whole lot more than somewhere else just down the street. The biggest point I think about this right now, to think about living conditions and lot sizes and walkability and health, as I think there's a 16-year difference in lifespan in the South Side neighborhoods, which is exactly 1 mile away from the North Side neighborhood that was built at the same exact time, right? Where the original like pioneers like lived,
Right. White pioneers, right? We're talking
about. Yeah. Yep, original white pioneers. And that was even wiping out the idea that the Hohokam or the Peeposh or any of the river peoples were there.
Of course, I love that sort of background, and I love to hear you talking about the folks who are living there and just getting by, and the density of the area in terms of the population.
Actually, one of the densest in the East Valley. It's one of the densest areas.
Right. And so you talk about these neighborhoods who are adjacent to one another in the context of like, they're all interconnected, right? Mm-hmm. They're all like, they come from different backgrounds. They come from different places. They're all sort of have been brought together or thrown together, if you will, through certain circumstances or happenstance, right? But they're all getting by. They're all living through it next to each other. And I guess my question to you is like, with your work with rail and what you've been doing for the greater part of the last decade, how does rail intersect with all of this? Is there like a story that you could share or an example that captures the kind of work that rail does to support local initiatives, or how do you do it?
Okay, so I guess I would think about a couple different things. Like there's kind of two sides of our business model, right? One side is very much heavily into small business technical assistance with a heavy target on women and people of color in low to moderate income census tracts, right? And that is very specifically to work with them and either create or help or further along businesses to be able to access capital at one point and also become an income supply or a wealth builder, right? So the better those businesses are doing, the better the neighborhood is generally doing, the better their families are doing, the better their employees are doing. And so on the small business side and the access to capital side, we've been working on that for a while since the light rail extension into Mesa, like we mentioned earlier, and we can come right back to that. But on the people side, when we realized that a lot of the people who work in those businesses also live generally very close, live in the neighborhoods very close to where they are. And so, I mean, one of the stories that comes to mind as to why we really started focusing on people a lot was when we had a gentleman who worked with his business. We were doing all these things with business. Finally got him very stabilized. He was very happy. He's like, yeah, we're doing better. We're hiring somebody else. Great. Awesome. He's like, and I'm so embarrassed to say this, but my house, which is almost paid off, I had to get a payday loan and they're going to take it from me in like a week. And we're like, dude, like you couldn't have told us this like a couple months ago, I know, but like you're helping with this. And
what was he thinking?
Yeah, and then so we got to working on it. And that was really our first idea in like, we need to become a financial opportunity center of some sort and help the people, the employees, the owners as people, not just a business, right? And back to that whole comprehensive circle, right? And then not only that, the minute we started helping him, these neighborhoods and that network connection, because they've been there so long, and we started getting other people saying, hey, like, didn't you help him with that thing? Like, how do we do it? Because we have the same problem. And same with businesses that have done the same thing with their businesses or properties or cars or equipments or anything like that. There's a lot of issues that happen. And so one of the things that ties these two types of work together, the people and the business side, is the way that we do it, I guess, right? And so back to your question is, how is it that it's done? Why is it getting noticed? And why is it special? Why is it different? We came up with kind of a model where we started doing pláticas, and it's just little talks, right? Pláticas, little talk in Spanish. And we kind of get neighbors together and we find out, we watch, we observe, we listen, we go where invited. And then we will notice or find a neighbor or a business owner who are really kind of like the chismoso, you know what I mean? Or the person who knows the neighborhood, who knows things, or,
Yeah.
And then we start saying, hey, like, ever thought of having your neighbors over just to talk about the neighborhood? We'll help you invite them. Just do it in your yard or at your business. We did one recently at Mickey's Hot Dogs, which is a little Sonoran hot dog stand. It was awesome. We've done them in the neighborhoods too at, the artist known as Scarlett's house. And we buy the food. If there's entertainment needed, we pay for that. We usually get some sort of art or activity that's it's like involved without having to like express some political opinion or something where someone's gonna get mad at you, right? So you got a bunch of neighbors showing up now, like, oh wow, I didn't know, like, I didn't know you, and I didn't know that person was there. I didn't know they had died or left or whatever, and all these conversations that are happening. And we just listen. And then once we listen, we start taking down these kind of notes and thinking about, okay, what is it that the neighborhood needs, and what are they going to tell us? Because it's not our job to go and do it for them. It's their right to work on the future of their neighborhood, but it's also their responsibility at the same time. Because if they're not doing it, who's going to do it? Yeah. Like if I'm trying to carry the torch for some neighborhood that I'm not even from, they're just going to look at me like I'm an idiot. And so you really need that hero, that community quarterback, or whatever you want to point it to. It's that person or that group of people. And so after we do the pláticas, we start taking them on neighborhood walks and just saying, hey, like, what do you think about this? Why do you think that bus stop has no roof over it? Why is there no bus stop there? Why is it just a hole in the ground? Why is there no shade? Why is there no lights? If there are a bunch of lights in this area, but not the street over, why do you think that is? And just asking questions, which then starts getting to think like, well, how do we deal with this? And then we say, well, there's a couple ways. You can do A, B, or C. You can show up at this council meeting. You can write letters. You can work with us on it, or you can start working with the neighborhood on some things. In the end of all this, what happens is we really are building a community group that now wants to do something, and they have a little bit of knowledge of what to do, right? The second side of that is when we're working with an area, we hire our organizer or people from that area. So it also gives us a little bit of that edge. Like on the south side, we have Saul, right? I've been starting to lovingly call him Southside Saul.
Nice. I
And
love that. I love Saul
yeah, it's
too.
awesome. And he knows everybody. And so and at this point, the idea of an autonomous group of people who are working together, but like he can be out doing things. He's doing things right now that I don't know what he's doing. I just call him at the end of the week and I'm like, so all these things are happening. Did this happen? Did that happen? He's like, yeah. And guess what? This is going to happen now. It's going to be awesome. There's a new mural we're going to do. And I'm like, all right, we didn't talk about that, but that's awesome. That's what the neighborhood wants. Let's figure out how to shift something from over here to do that over there, And when I say something, I usually mean, grant funding from LISC or something, some risk, something that's happening, Or yeah, so that's kind of the thing, But usually then that funding or that resource is then multiplied by people power, community ingenuity, and then some other group is like, dang, I need to fulfill my DEI requirements. How do I do that with you guys, or something?
There's so much in there that we could unpack that could just be a standalone conversation. For instance, this two-tiered model that you have with respect to providing technical assistance to the small businesses in the area, but then focusing on, the actual people, right? That care that you're putting into the recognition of the neighborhood or the community as a collection of not just the businesses or the place, the physical place, but the actual people within it. And it's a truly empowerment or ownership model, right? It's truly helping folks have the tools necessary for their self-determination and realizing their own worth so that they can then put that into action. And I think it seems like such a no-brainer. It's almost like going back to doing it for the neighborhood. It's like, it makes so much sense, and yet it's not done, nearly as widely as it ought to be around other communities, certainly here, and around the state and country as well.
I think it's part of a recognition of roles, right? I mean, so that's how you got into this kind of work, I think, through city work, right? Or did you have other work before that?
Yeah. So before I took on the position with LISC almost 2 years ago, I have about 20 years of experience working in the public sector and at the local level. So I worked for 13 years in Pima County down in Tucson, which is home for me. I cut my teeth working in the city of South Tucson in the same communities that you're describing now, very densely populated, predominantly Spanish-speaking communities, also Native and Indigenous communities, and really just like I had a mentor who was a county supervisor down there by the name of Dan Ekstrom, and who taught me everything I know about organizing and getting people together and empowering them with the tools that they need to self-determine. And going into like a lot of what you're talking about with like the pláticas, it's like going in and not telling them what we think they need, but rather just asking them and just listening. Like that simple act of listening is it's so important and it's so powerful, and it goes such a long way in building that trust. But anyway, to your point, like, yes, so I've cut my teeth on this kind of work as well.
Right. I mean, and the reason why I brought that up is because when we were saying like, this idea of a role recognition, right? So when you're looking at like a city role, I mean, it would be awesome if cities really work to empower neighborhoods. But for them, it's more like, hey, we got to function as a city. Like, I'm going to outreach to you. I'm going to throw some flyers at your door and tell you some opportunities that are coming up. But like, there's like 200 other neighborhoods out here. I got to throw flyers at them too. And so for them, we're just recognizing that's maybe not their job to do that, right? And then there's the groups that are a little bit larger, like maybe, I don't know what you would call them, but like these nonprofits who've been around forever, or, and CDCs and nonprofits and these structural things, it is not lost on me that they are used to control and put neighborhoods down a lot of times, right? They're part of structural racism. They're part of all these things that happen, right?
Absolutely.
So I'm not trying to say that by any means our CDC is the savior, because I learn every day that I don't know a lot of things. They are the engagement people. Like, they're like, hey, like, we need to fix your neighborhood. Like, I need you to help me do this to your neighborhood. Like, we're going to do a mural to your neighborhood. Like, come with me. Let's do it. That's the engagement folks, right?
Yeah.
And we like to push past that and say, no, we're like the empowerment people, because I don't even necessarily want to do it. Like, I like doing it. I like being there. I love like the power and the feeling that's there. But really what I want is some neighborhood leader, our mural guy, David Martinez, right? Who's now become one of our businesses on the business side also. But he picks up and does murals. He gets the community to come out, a bunch of kids. And, we work with the Boys and Girls Club and, and Danny on Grand and all these people that I can just name that I would probably never know. But now they're somebody on that place,
That's cool. And I think you've touched upon something that's really pivotal there, which is that the magic's already in these communities, right? These folks, they live and work and play and worship and do all the things already in these places. It's really about you like bringing it out of them, almost like it's an extraction process, right? Like the building of that trust is then over time, like bringing this out. And that's where the real spark is. And where the real magic happens is where these local neighborhood leaders who were there all along are the ones who are coming out and like really doing all of that work and really driving so much of the action behind that empowerment and that decision-making process.
One of the funny things I remember, even like on the downtown kind of area, I was eating at one of the restaurants yesterday, and one of the shop owners that came in kind of at the end of when we were really like getting finished with the work, which was really the beginning of the work, and we could talk about that in a second, but she's like, oh, well, all us business owners, we've always been getting together and we know each other. We're like a family down here. And I'm like, oh yeah, I know. I remember. I used to be the one walking from door to door saying, how's business today? What's going on? Are we hanging out this week with this group and blah, blah, And so I'm like, yeah, I know. I remember how it happened, I remember when that was our work, trying to keep business in line when the light rail was coming through and they had it torn up and you couldn't even enter the front door, right? So, I mean, that reminded me exactly of like, they know each other. The fact that you can go down and be norm somewhere. I used to always say, like, everyone wants to be norm. If you want to win over like a community, you just have to make everyone feel like they're norm, right? Norm, and I don't know if most people know that, but Norm from Cheers, you go in like, hey, Norm.
Yeah, totally.
If you walked in a place like that and you felt like that everywhere you went, you'd be like, I want to stay in this place forever. I love it,
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned sort of the buildup to light rail in Mesa. Let's go back to that time, right? Now we've set the stage a little bit for the area that you work in, what Mesa's like right now. Let's go back to the coming of light rail in the early 2000s. What was the story in Mesa at that time? What were you doing then? And what were, some of the attitudes and the hopes and concerns for what better transit might bring to the community?
Right. So at the time, I mean, Mesa still has a lot of this too, but there's a lot of, I don't know if you know what Agenda 21 is. Yeah, there's people who
I've heard it sort of spoken about, in certain.
Yeah. So people were, when light rail was coming to Mesa, it had originally been denied and it ended in Tempe, right? So the largest light rail active station was the one at Sycamore Station, because everyone from the East Valley would drive over there. It was a massive, massive parking lot, and they would take the light rail to Phoenix to work, whatever that was, right? And so finally we had a mayor that named Scott Smith who had a vision and was like, why didn't we extend this? Let's bring it to Stapley, which is, I don't know, maybe five streets down, 5 big streets, by the way. So Mesa does like mile-long blocks. So, it's a long way.
So 5 more miles down the way.
I don't remember it was 5 exactly, but it was a good, like that amount somewhere. All of a sudden, everyone's like, oh my God, like, you're trying to make us one of those future cities and you're going to cause all these problems and Agenda 21 and like all these, things are happening around. Like, why are you urbanizing and modernizing? We're like Mesa, like the old days, this kind of stuff, I think we like to joke about it at that time being called Mesa Berry because it was like Mayberry. Like the idea was that Mesa's like Mayberry, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Very sleepy, and I can go down to Joe's and I could see, old man Joe and see what he's doing, you know what I mean?
Totally. Everybody knows everybody else.
Yeah. But the thing was that it was everybody did know everybody else, but it was also very much dying, like
Right.
there was just nothing new was happening. No young people wanted to be there. No innovation was happening, all that stuff. So with this new mayor, he was like, yeah, we got to do this. We got to bring in some universities. We have to bring in a few breweries and like, let's just really get this downtown going. It's been dead too long. And so with all that stuff, it had all these feelings. And then that's when Terry had this great idea of like, hey, if you're going to do this, why don't we plan ahead and figure out how we can save these businesses by paying for their, electrical bills during the summertime through the city electric, since we have our own electric grid there in downtown. And why don't we only do construction during like the hottest months where no one's going to the store anyways? And then, in exchange, we'll have all these businesses have to take, better business classes and how to be a better business. And then we can lend to them throughout it to make sure that they stay there. And the mayor was like, this is a great plan. Like, why not? Let's do it. And then so in turn, Terry was like, all right, now I got to find people. So she found me, she found Augie, she found this guy, David Crummy, who became kind of our real estate type person. She found Jen Gastelum, who was kind of our placemaking person. She had us all trained at Railvolution, actually, which is an interesting thing. Yeah. And NeighborWorks and some of these other things. We all went to training. We all kind of picked different areas. I kind of functioned as the organizer. And literally for the next 3-4 years, we did art interventions. We basically created the mural sign code to be able to do it. We created really the ability to do art in an area. And I'm not saying we wrote it, but what I'm saying is we created enough friction to where the city was like, all right, we have to react. So let's give permission in these parameters, Between all that business work and all that things that we did, we actually, at the end of it, we were like, great success. Like light rail's here, it's flowing. We actually copied the Minnesota St. Paul method of having a party for every station. We actually went there to see what they did, and then also worked with some of the folks from that area to be really creative, or at least copying creativity, and do our own style. And then we had a net zero business loss because we had lost 10, but we gained 10, and we gained a bunch of like buzz around what's happening downtown. There's a new light rail, there's space open, there's like, man, what's happening? Like there's all these cool businesses that are very unique. They're not chains. Like we got to check that out, right? And then at this time, some other things were happening. And as everyone knows, the cycles of investment, people saw the light rail as like, okay, things are going to get bad, so we can swoop in and buy things. Everyone's going to be scared, so they're going to be, I sell all I can.
Right.
And then something happened. Something happened that we didn't know would happen, which totally changed the way that we continued our work.
You mentioned Terry again, and how at the time she sort of gave some really, I think, strategic and important advice was, well, if this is going to happen, if you're serious about wanting to invest in these neighborhoods through light rail, how are you going to prepare for it? What are you going to do that's actually going to, as you're sort of preparing for the inevitability of the light rail being present in these communities, how are you going to plan to make sure that you can mitigate the effect that this new infrastructure is going to have on these communities? And obviously I wasn't with LISC at the time, but LISC Phoenix began investing in the Main Street corridor there with support. I think it was a State Farm grant that we had in 2008.
Yeah.
And then there was also the LISC Metro Edge, right, which launched in 2005 to seed and support development and economic growth along commercial corridors, right? So, and we were chosen for the Corridors of Retail Excellence, or the CORE initiative, that focused on Main Street in Mesa. But my point is that this idea of thinking, and we've touched upon this a little bit, right? This idea of thinking in the long term, right, that leads to lasting results is so crucial to supporting the infrastructure, and more importantly, supporting the communities in which this infrastructure is going to affect, right? So even as far back as 2002, our partners at Native American Connections here in Phoenix, they purchased a single-story building in downtown Phoenix on the corner of 2nd Avenue and Fillmore in the Roosevelt Historic District, my neighborhood currently. It was all about this forward thinking. It was all about how are we going to get ahead of this, right? Of course, today it's, I think that's the location of the urban living on Fillmore, right? So they ended up using that, like it used to be across the street from where their headquarters were located, and their behavioral health center was also there as well. But they used that investment to build affordable housing on that same site, because I think it was like 5 years later that they moved their headquarters to over on Central Avenue and Indian School, where the LISC Phoenix offices actually were for several years before coming back downtown. But I mean, it's this sort of thinking ahead, I think, that makes all the difference, right? We may wish for quick fixes for the challenges our communities face, but we know that sustainable community development takes time, right? It takes a vision of what it could be. It takes early investments of expertise and funding. It takes being ready with the right partners to seize an opportunity. It takes longstanding commitment to see a project through to results, and you can't have these success stories without this long-term thinking that lead to these lasting impacts. And I think that's part of what, you're talking about a little bit, like about how, there was this great potential in light rail and how it could connect people to jobs or school in a more reliable and affordable way. But there were efforts that needed to be instituted to mitigate the disruption and to preserve not only the actual local businesses, but preserve the communities themselves.
All right. Yeah. I was gonna say it's like a 10-year plan, right? And I remember when light rail was done and the businesses were like, all right, yeah, like finally, like customers are gonna pour in. And we're like, no, not yet. It's still gonna be a couple of years where people even understand what's going on,
Yeah.
And that's when we started thinking like, all right, what is the next few years to look like? And not only that, the big piece of it that we didn't even think about was, what does the future of housing look like? What does the future of ownership look like? Because we knew there was affordable housing going up at that time, but we had assumed that that was going to be kind of consistent going forward, not that it would be a one-time thing. And so there's a lot of things you have to consider when you're working with an area like this, right?
Yeah. What were some of the challenges of trying to interface with such a massive project that was happening? Like what were you guys up against?
So when I try to compare now on the south side to then in West Mesa in the light rail corridor, like they're one street apart, right? And so like it's Broadway and Main, right? They're built around the same time. They have very similar features. A lot of things are similar. With Broadway now, I have a bigger vision. I'm like, and when I talk to the city, I'm like, so can you imagine that this could be like the Latino downtown for the entire valley? Because it would be the only one kind of called the Latino downtown, right? And they're like, we already have a downtown. I'm like, I know, but what if you had two? You know what I mean? It's like, does it have to be
why does it only have to be one? Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I mean, like,
I'm sorry. We can only have one Latino downtown.
There's only one Main Street, And I'm like, but what if there's a Latino version of it? And like both of them are awesome and different,
Yeah.
And equally busy and fun and, all these things. And one of the things we're up against is that we didn't really think of. I mean, I didn't think about it. I'll put it that way. And us, as we continued, is that behind the scenes, we should have been working on this wealth building strategy of like, how do you own the place you are? Because what we didn't think, and we knew that all of these like legacy owners had owned most of the buildings, which are like from the 1900s in the Main Street area, but we didn't think that they might one day sell it and kick everybody out. You know what I mean? And so I was like, oh, wait, what's happening here? We just worked for years to keep that business there, and now they got kicked out. Why? What happened? They're paying their rent, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's almost like gentrification it's such an ominous threat, but when you're in the process of trying to help communities navigate these really sort of tricky, huge infrastructure projects, sometimes that can be like taken for granted, right? It's like, we're going to help these guys to stick around. There's no way in heck that they're ever going to be gentrified, that they're ever going to be priced out or forced out, as long as they play by the rules, right? And do everything that they're supposed to do. And sometimes it's funny, that can be that can be a naive way to think, right? And sometimes we if we're not careful, we can miss the mark, to your point about that. So, okay, we're gonna pause here, right? So setting the stage, light rail is about to open, connecting Mesa with Tempe and Phoenix. The light rail construction and the light rail transit spawns more than $400 million in new projects for Mesa. Benedictine University, ASU campus in Mesa, the Asian district investment and everything that went into there. When we come back, when we return on the next exciting episode of the Impact Podcast, we're going to look at the story for existing residents and businesses and the foundations of Rail's work today. But before we go, a question about big infrastructure projects in general. How can communities be better able to engage? And, you mentioned this earlier about like knowing your role, and there's a place for like city and local government, and then some of the other CDCs like yourself who are doing similar work. But what could cities or planners or regional bodies do to signal a relationship of trust? How can they better build this trust?
I think about this a lot because I often wonder what would be the actual, like, the key piece of it, or what's the end of there, what's like the aha moment people are going to have. But what I think it's multiple things, right? So if I were to look at the city of Mesa today and their internal, staff and the big decision makers, almost none of them look like the people that we work with on the South Side or the Asian district or things like this, right? And that is not to say that you always need a seat at somebody else's table. It just means that you have to be able to build another table that's awesome enough to have two tables. And that table is like, dang, that table looks pretty good over there. It's different, but let's go check it out, And then at my table, I'm like, well, yeah, we know we're different, but you guys have always been at this table, and it was time another table started. And I also want to eat at your table, but we need to have some like rules of engagement here, So I almost wonder. LISC has a decent paper out about it that talks about building these two power broker groups, and one is of the community, from the community, lived experience by the community, and one is the obvious power players who came from somewhere. They could have somewhere in the community, and how those interact. So to answer, I don't know the exact answer, but I do know what has been working is building groups of power within the neighborhoods that are the most affected.
Nice. Yeah, I love that.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this week's podcast, and you can find out more at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And sign up for our 17-year-old newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com. To get the show each week, follow along at your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, YouTube, TuneIn, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.